This week we're going to try something different. So over this week I've had a number of people ask me about something very unusual, and I've had to explain this concept a number of times, so I think this is perhaps the best time to actually start explaining this concept. So I'm going to do this for this whole week. And what is this thing I'm going to be talking about? I'm going to be talking about down. What is down? Let's find out. Welcome to Multi-Loving Model, the channel that shows you how to handle multiple interests, multiple relationships, and multiple approaches to finance. My name is Gerald, and I help people to figure out their way through life, love, and learning in order to customize their own happiness. Today is going to be an interesting one. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. And if you've been on this channel before, welcome back. I hope this video will find you well. For this week, what we're going to be covering is the concept of down, and then specifically for Multi-Mission Monday, we're going to be covering how this applies to learning itself. So first and foremost, let's figure out what is down. So down is basically desires, obsessions, wants, and needs. These are the four things that go into every single person's considerations, and it is actually very important for us to actually understand what they are. An alternative way of looking at it is you can use DAWN. So that would stand for desires, addictions, wants, and needs. So in my own case, I would actually pair up addictions and obsessions as pretty much the same thing in this particular context under this definition. So first and foremost, in order to understand how I actually categorize this thing, right? So we have these things split up into these four sections. How do I determine what is what? Here's how. The first criteria that we talk about is, does it affect happiness or misery? And I think the easiest way to look about this is to look at needs first. So needs are things that you require in order for you to continue living, in order for you to continue your current existence. So a great example of a need is oxygen, or say water. All of us need oxygen or water in order to survive. So what happens to us if we do not have enough water or oxygen? We feel thirsty, or we feel that we are suffocating. From this point onwards, I'll just refer to it as oxygen. I will skip the water part. So oxygen. If you do not have enough oxygen, the oxygen level in the atmosphere is 50% of what it is. How are you going to feel? You're going to feel pretty bad, right? But what happens if you have too much oxygen? Do you gain happiness out of having so much oxygen? Well, you could get a little bit high, but generally speaking, you're not going to have a lot of happiness. If let's say I told you that, we've got a lot of oxygen and there are another 20 canisters of oxygen for you to use whenever you need to, and you're a healthy, functioning adult, normally speaking, you're not going to be entirely excited about this prospect. But if you had a lack of oxygen, you would distinctly be miserable. So that is the first criteria, whether it's happiness or miserable. So needs affect your misery. The second thing to consider is whether or not this thing is sudden or gradual. Now, what do I mean by that? A sudden change means that something spikes up and then it drops back down, right? So it's acute, it goes up, it goes down really, really quickly. Whereas for gradual, it means that it goes along with. It doesn't spike up suddenly, it doesn't jump very much, but it goes a very slow way. It goes up and it stays up. Acute goes up and then it falls back down. So let's apply this to our need for oxygen. Let's look at it over here, right? Oxygen. If you have half of the oxygen you require, you're going to be suffering. You're going to be miserable. What happens if you get an extra 10%? Does the amount of misery you have suddenly drop? Do you suddenly get wildly excited because you suddenly have a little bit more oxygen, even though it's not enough? Not really. If anything, the amount of misery you feel, it is inversely proportional to the amount of oxygen that actually is in the room. As oxygen levels rise, your misery level also drops. It's not like you raise up oxygen a little bit and then suddenly your misery just spikes down and then bounces back up. It doesn't happen like that. It's just very gradual. As your oxygen level goes up, your misery goes down. So that is needs. Needs affect the misery, and they are gradual. That's the first category. The next category I want to talk about is wants. So now we have N, we have W. So the W is wants. There's a saying that I've heard, and I don't really know who it's from, but it says that human wants are infinite. and you'll see it over there. So what does this mean? As humans, we want so many things. I want a new car, I want a new bag, I want a new job, I want more money, I want more people in my life, I want more friends, I want a better phone, I want more games, I want more money to play those games, I want more time. I want so many things. It's a lot of materialism, it's a lot of getting stuff just for the pleasure of it. It's hedonistic. But why is that so? Let's look at it this way. First and foremost, do wants affect your misery or your happiness? If you don't have a want, are you necessarily miserable? Probably not. For example, I may want a gold Ferrari, which I don't. Please don't send me one. Give me the money instead. But let's say I did want a gold Ferrari. Well, number one, if I don't have it, am I actually miserable because of it? No, I should not be miserable because of it. But if I do get it, will it make me happy? Yes, it will. It will cause my happiness to go up. So now we know wants affect happiness, not misery. That's the first factor. Now the second factor, does it spike or is it gradual? So let's think of it this way. If I suddenly received a gold Ferrari, will I just gradually be a little more happy? Or will it be all at once and suddenly I'm just really happy? And then a couple weeks later, a couple months later, the excitement drops. Truth of the matter is, for wants, anytime you fulfill a want, it spikes up and then it will come back down after a period of time. So what that means is that overall it increases your happiness, but it's only for a short period of time. This is how I categorize wants, and this will be relevant later. So just to do a quick recap, wants are things that increase your happiness, but they cause your happiness to spike up, and your happiness then drops down later on. So that is wants. So the third part of this, right? So we have W, we have N. Now, I'm going to move on with D, and D is for desire. So let's look at it now this way, right? So desires, first and foremost, do they affect your happiness or do they affect your misery? Before that. So what are desires? Desires are things that in general improve your quality of life. So like for example, while I may need a place to stay, I would desire to have perhaps an apartment or perhaps a home for myself, right? Full story. I may desire to have 2 stories instead of 1. So a desire in general affects your quality of life in a way that allows you to be happier. So that's our clue right over there. It affects the happiness meter, and as we already went through the acute, obviously this is going to be the gradual one. So why do I say that this affects happiness? Well, let's say that I have a small place to live in, right? I've got a shoebox apartment. It's not fantastic, it's not amazing, but it's a place to stay. My need for a place to stay is fulfilled, right? So without a place to stay, I'll be miserable. It's not about happiness. I'm just trying to catch up with the misery there. Now that I've fulfilled a place to stay, not the place to stay, a place to stay, I have fulfilled my need. Now that I've fulfilled my need, that anything else is about increasing that level of happiness at this point. Because I don't need any larger place of living. Unless I do, like perhaps I have got a family and I've got like 5 kids running around, and okay, fine, I may need that extra space, right? So then that becomes a need rather than a desire. But let's say I'm by myself and I'd like a 2-story building. If let's say I did manage to get a 2-story building, or let's say I just get a small upgrade, I get, instead of a shoebox apartment, I get perhaps a 3-room apartment, right? 3-room, 1 bathroom perhaps, or whatever it is, right? So I got a 3-room apartment. How would that make me feel? Would I be happier? Yes. Now here's the thing. Will the happiness suddenly just drop down, or will it move up along with my increase in living? And then if I get more, if I upgrade even further, does that happiness continue to rise? So you see, desire, generally speaking, raises your happiness along with whatever it is that you do get. So the difference between wants and desires is this. Desires are things that improve your overall quality of life, that allows you to increase your baseline of happiness. Whereas wants are things that increase your happiness but do not actually increase your baseline of happiness. So that is the difference. And finally, we come to the last category, which is obsessions or addictions. Choose whichever you prefer. I prefer DOWN. What categories are remaining? So the last category that we have is miserable. Obsessions or addictions affect your misery and it causes spikes. So wait, how does this work? So think of it this way. Think of a stalker, right? I know this is a bit cringe, but bear with me here, right? Imagine a stalker and he's interested in you. How is he going to feel when he can't have you? He's going to feel rather miserable, right? It's not like I can't get to you, so whatever, life goes on. No, it's I'm obsessed with you. I'm addicted to you. I need you, right? So it's going to affect the misery meter. What happens if he suddenly gets a small dose of you, right? So let's say you pass by him in the morning and you say, hi, and that's it, right? And you walked off. He's just suddenly got pretty much a hit of dopamine, the same way that a drug addict would get a sudden hit based on the drug that he uses, right? It's a small dosage, but it suddenly causes the person to just spike up in overall happiness. What that actually means is that it is actually reducing the misery amount. So however miserable he was feeling, having that little shot of it will suddenly spike that misery counter. He will become suddenly a lot less miserable and his brain will obsess over it, he'll think it over, and then as time goes by, that meter drops down yet again and he is still miserable. And so he wants more. He seeks more. He seeks a higher dosage and things like that. So if you look at it that way, right, having a little bit of an obsession causes your misery to plunge very suddenly. But it also causes it to go back up after a while. It doesn't decrease your overall level of misery. And that's the key. So the difference between needs and obsessions is anytime that you are able to fulfill a need, however incomplete, it causes your baseline misery to go down a little bit. Whereas for an obsession, it causes your overall misery to plunge down, but then it goes back up and perhaps even exceeds your previous level. So that is the defining factor there. Now we have it, right? So we have DOWN or DAWN, whichever you prefer, and they are categorized as such. How does this tie into learning? This is a similar concept that has been covered by other people before, but I will just put a small little spin on it. Looking at your tasks, right? You have things that are important and you have things that are urgent. Well, this is similar in this regard, isn't it? So now let's talk about interests. There are plenty of things that all of us want to do, but not everything that we desire to do. There are also things that we need to do, and there are also things that we obsess over. And so, how do we allocate time in order to deal with these things? This is what Multi-Mission Monday will cover for this portion. Now, in general, you want to focus on just 3 categories. You will want to focus on your desires, your wants, and your needs. Why not obsession or addiction? Obsessions and addictions have a way of taking over your life. So, for example, if I'm addicted to computer games, it's a very high likelihood that without outside intervention, what's going to happen is that video games are going to take over my life and I would not have any time left over to deal with my needs, my wants, and my desires. While I might desire to build a successful YouTube channel, the sheer fact that I'm addicted to games actually will hinder that, which is partly true. Therefore, what you need to do for your obsessions or addictions is you need to find a way to recruit other people to help you on this aspect. Whether it be an accountability group or a machine that stops you permanently, and that sounds so wrong, or some kind of automatic system that prevents you from going online, for example. Addictions preferably should be managed with the help of other people. And that's it. That will free up some time for you to fulfill your needs, your wants, and your desires. Now that we've established that your obsession should really be at the very bottom of your list of things to do, next we'll look at the third which is the least important of the remaining three: your needs, your wants, and your desires? Let's have a think about it. So think back to the definitions. Needs are things that actually allow you to continue to live, to reap the rewards of your happiness. So those are important. Desires also increase your baseline of happiness, and therefore they are also important for you to focus on. And then finally, you have your wants, which increase your happiness but do not necessarily raise your baseline of happiness. Therefore, just before obsessions, so when obsessions are the fourth place, your third place should really be your wants, because they're not critical. It is great to have, but you don't necessarily need them per se. They are good to have as a backup when you are feeling really, really down and you just need a very quick boost. Great to have wants able to be fulfilled, but otherwise you should focus on your needs and your desires instead. Next, let's look at your needs versus your desires. Think of it this way. Desires raise your baseline of happiness, but enjoying the fruits of that happiness takes time. So for example, if I do get a 2-story apartment, it will take time for me to fully enjoy the experience of having a 2-story apartment. And as for needs, if I do not fulfill my needs, then generally speaking, life becomes really difficult to live. And in a general sense, things that cause you to be miserable are far more impactful than things that cause you to be happy. Losing money is more powerful a deterrent than winning money. So with that in mind, think about it this way. Needs allow you to continue living in order for you to enjoy the happiness that you have built up. Even if you build up a very high happiness level, but you are constantly struggling with your needs, you are going to be consistently miserable. And that is not going to positively impact your life. You're going to be focusing a lot on your negatives, your misery part, rather than focusing on what you do have. For example, if you have a mansion, right? So, or let's say I have my 2-story house, but I have a chronic condition. So let's say I'm constantly having back pain. It's not going to allow me to really fully enjoy my 2-story apartment. Whereas if I'm able to get rid of my back pain, even if I don't have that 2-story apartment, I'm generally going to be alright. I may not be extremely happy, but I wouldn't be miserable. And that is the one that is the critical part. With that in mind, your needs should always generally be at the very top of your priority. You need to attend to your needs first, and then you focus on your desires, your wants, and finally, your obsessions. So now the question is, how do you actually manage this? Obsessions, like I mentioned, should be dealt with as little as possible. You should want to minimize the amount of time you spend on your obsessions, realistically speaking. But it's not always possible. You're going to have to relapse. You need to budget time to cater to your addictions while you are reducing them from an addiction to a want. So that's the priority. You want to change obsessions and transfer them into the wants category instead. So for that, you need as many people to reduce that timing as much as possible. So that's your management for obsessions. Next is for your wants. How do you manage your wants? Well, wants should be something that generally take very little time for you to deal with. Let's say you want to go out and fly a kite. Well, is that really that important in the grand scheme of things? Not really. Is that really going to boost your happiness? Not really. Right? It's not a need, it's not a desire, it's not going to improve your overall level of happiness. But if you're feeling especially down, these are activities that you want to do that are short and that you can get out of the way really quickly, but you know are going to give you that happiness boost that you might need. So that is how I would say you should aim to manage your wants. Things that you can get done really quickly, that give you that happiness boost as quickly as possible, and that's it. Before we move on to desires, let's address needs. So needs are things that you need to get done in order to survive and to enjoy the fruits of your happiness and things like that, but they don't bring you that happiness. So no matter how much of your needs you fulfill, generally speaking, you're not going to get any happier. How should you deal with needs? You should try to aim to reduce the time as much as possible. For every need that you need to fulfill, like for example, if you need to pay your bills, you need to cook food, you need to do whatever it is, clean up the place, wash the clothes and whatsoever. As far as possible, your aim is to minimize the time as much as possible. So, how do you do that? You can either automate the process. So for example, payment of bills. You would want to perhaps set up an automatic account where you put all your money into that account, and whatever bills that needs to be paid get automatically transferred out of that. So as little needs on your mind as possible. Your needs are the most important, but you want to reduce as much time as possible so that your mind is thinking of as little needs as possible in order to focus on what really matters, which are your desires. And then finally we get to your desires. So desires are the things that you want to spend the most amount of time on, because ultimately they will raise your standard of happiness. The distraction, however, is that most of the time we are always preoccupied with either our needs, our wants, or our obsessions. The things that we should all be reducing the amount of time on, instead of focusing on these things, your desires, the things that cause you to be happy. So with that in mind, what you would want to do is to try to budget as much time as you can, right? So look into your other areas, reduce the amount of time that you can spend on each of these other three areas, and then spend the rest of that time focusing, really dedicating yourself, using whatever techniques to try to increase the amount of time you spend on fulfilling your desires. And this is the general flow of things. So if you think about it, doesn't this actually correlate to important versus urgent, right? So if, for example, if something affects your level of misery, then generally speaking, it is an urgent thing. Whereas if it affects your happiness, it is not as urgent. Because in general, no matter how happy you are, if you're miserable as well, you're generally going to feel the misery first. And therefore, anything that affects your misery level are things that are going to be more urgent. And then, if you look at in terms of whether your baseline spikes or is gradual, that kind of determines what is important. Because things that are not important, they spike and they come straight back down, or even worse, they go in a negative direction. They do not actually have a lasting impact. Whereas things that increase your baseline of happiness or reduce your baseline of misery, those are things that have more lasting impacts, and therefore those are important. So if you look at it this way, and you look at this chart, right, do you notice how this is different? Your needs are things that are important and also urgent, and therefore these are the number one things you want to get rid of. Again, you don't want to spend too much time on that, right? They're urgent, get rid of them as quickly as possible and move on. Then you move down to your desires, which are things that are important, that are things that raise your level of happiness, but are not necessarily urgent. So these are the things that you want to spend as much time on, actually. The things that are not important and not urgent, which are your wants, these are the things that you want to spend as little time as possible, only use them when it's necessary. And finally, for your obsessions, they are not important, they are not going to contribute to your overall happiness level, but because they are constantly on your mind, they are going to constantly be urgent. And therefore you want to recruit other people to help you to overcome and move on from those obsessions as quickly as possible. So that's it for my concept of down: desires, obsessions, wants and needs. And I hope that you've had a better idea of what those four things are and how it actually pertains to important versus urgent. Do you think this was actually useful? Do you think this has been an interesting perspective on the rather commonly used important versus urgent dynamic? Do you think that this helps you to better manage your time in regards to your interests? Let me know down in the comment sections below. If this video has been helpful to you, or you know of somebody whom you think this is of use for, why not share it with them? I'd really appreciate that, and definitely the channel could use a boost. If you've liked what you heard so far and you want to have more content about how to handle multiple interests, relationships, or approaches to finance, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. My name is Gerald, and this is Multi-Loving Model. Be happy in diversity. Cheers.